In the grand halls of Haverford Hall, a priceless sapphire necklace vanishes during a lavish family gathering, plunging the guests into a web of suspicion. Miss Jane Marple, a sharp-eyed spinster with a knack for uncovering secrets, steps into the shadows of deceit. Was it the charming but desperate cousin, the bitter aunt with a claim to the jewel, the enigmatic butler with a hidden past, or the vibrant artist with a keen eye for detail? As clues unravel, a scuff mark in the garden, a whispered debt, a hollowed-out book, Miss Marple's quiet wisdom reveals a truth that cuts deeper than the sapphire's gleam. In this classic tale of greed and betrayal, no one is quite what they seem. Chapter 1. The Gathering at Haverford Hall. The late August sun dipped low over Haverford Hall, its golden light softening the austere lines of the Georgian manor, nestled in the rolling hills of Sussex. Lady Beatrice Haverford, a widow of 60 whose poised elegance belied her years, had summoned a select group to celebrate her birthday in the grand style her family name demanded. The occasion promised fine company, finer wine, and the unveiling of her most treasured possession, an antique sapphire necklace, its lineage as storied as the Haverfords themselves. The manor's tall windows glowed warmly, and the scent of late-blooming roses drifted from the gardens, mingling with the anticipation that hung in the air. The guest list was intimate, curated with care. Gerald Winthrop, Lady Beatrice's cousin, arrived first, his tailored suit slightly frayed at the cuffs, a detail that betrayed his strained finances, despite his easy smile and polished manners. Mrs. Clara Pennington, Lady Beatrice's aunt, swept in with the authority of her 70 years. Her black silk dress rustling, and her sharp grey eyes appraising every detail of the hall as if it were hers by right. Mr. Reginald Stokes, the butler, glided through the rooms with silent precision, his formal demeanour masking a past that whispered of secrets. The final guest, Miss Evelyn Carver, a young artist of striking beauty and unconventional charm, brought a spark of modernity to the gathering, her laughter echoing through the oak-panelled halls. Miss Jane Marple, a slight figure in a neat tweed suit, arrived unobtrusively by the afternoon train. Her invitation had been a courteous gesture, extended through a mutual acquaintance in St. Mary Mead, and Lady Beatrice greeted her with the distracted warmth of a hostess juggling many duties. Miss Marple, her knitting bag tucked under her arm, settled into a corner of the drawing-room, her mild blue eyes taking in the scene. The other guests barely noticed her, a fact that suited her perfectly. She had a way of blending into the wallpaper, her quiet presence as unremarkable as the ticking of the grandfather clock. Yet she missed nothing. As the evening drew on, the company gathered for pre-dinner drinks. Lady Beatrice, resplendent in emerald silk, stood before the marble fireplace, her guests arrayed around her like courtiers. "My dears," she said, her voice carrying the refined cadence of her class, "tonight is not merely a celebration of my years, but of our family's legacy." With a flourish, she opened a velvet-lined case, revealing the sapphire necklace. Its deep blue stones, set in intricate silver filigree, caught the chandelier's light, casting flecks of azure across the room. A murmur of admiration rippled through the guests, though Miss Marple noted the varied shades of their reactions. Gerald's eyes lingered on the jewels, his smile tightening as if calculating their worth. He raised his glass, toasting his cousin's generosity, but his fingers gripped the stem a fraction too tightly. Clara, seated stiffly in a high-backed chair, gave a faint sniff, her lips pursing as though the display offended her sense of propriety. "A fine piece," she remarked, her tone implying it was wasted on Beatrice. Evelyn, standing near the window, clapped her hands in delight, her artist's eye clearly captivated by the necklace's craftsmanship. "It's like something from a Renaissance painting," she said, her voice bright. Stokes, hovering at the edge of the room, offered no comment, but his gaze flicked to the case with professional detachment, or so it seemed. Miss Marple, her knitting needles clicking softly, observed these reactions as one might study a chessboard. She recalled a similar gathering in St. Mary Mead, where a stolen brooch had revealed the true character of a trusted friend. People she knew were rarely as they appeared, and jewels had a way of bringing those hidden facets to light. Gerald's strange charm reminded her of young Tommy Pierce, who had once pawned his mother's ring to cover a foolish bet. Clara's disapproval echoed old Mrs. Grayson, whose envy of her sister's wealth had festered into spite. Evelyn's enthusiasm seemed genuine, but Miss Marple had met charming rogues before. And Stokes, well, butlers were often privy to more than they let on. As dinner was announced, the guests moved to the dining room, their conversation turning to lighter matters, weather, politics, the latest London plays. Lady Beatrice locked the necklace back in its case, placing it on a sideboard under Stokes's watchful eye. Miss Marple, trailing behind, paused to admire a portrait of a Haverford ancestor, her mind already sifting through the evening's impressions. The necklace, she sensed, was more than a jewel. It was a catalyst, poised to reveal the secrets of Haverford Hall. Her needles clicked on, a quiet counterpoint to the laughter and clink of glasses, as the first shadows of suspicion began to form. Chapter 2. The Disappearance. The morning after Lady Beatrice Haverford's birthday celebration dawned bright and clear, with the sun filtering through the heavy curtains of Haverford Hall, casting long, lazy patterns across the polished floors. The guests, still basking in the glow of the previous evening's festivities, were roused by the gentle clatter of breakfast preparations. The air carried the comforting aroma of fresh coffee and warm scones, and the household seemed poised for a day of leisurely conversation and strolls through the manicured gardens. But this tranquillity was shattered just before 9 o'clock by a piercing scream that echoed through the manor's upper corridors, sharp and urgent like a crack in a pane of glass. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the morning room with her knitting, paused mid-stitch, her keen ears attuned to the sound. It came from the direction of Lady Beatrice's boudoir, and within moments the house was alive with movement. Footsteps hurried along the hallways, voices called out in alarm, and the heavy tread of the butler, Mr. Reginald Stokes, could be heard ascending the stairs. Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her calm demeanour unshaken, and rose to follow the commotion, her slight figure moving with the quiet purpose of one accustomed to observing life's dramas unfold. In the boudoir, a scene of disarray greeted her. Lady Beatrice stood in the centre of the room, her face drained of colour, her hands clutching the edge of a mahogany dressing table. The velvet-lined case that had held the sapphire necklace lay open before her, its interior starkly empty. The intricate silver clasp, designed to secure the priceless heirloom, gleamed mockingly in the morning light, a silent testament to the theft. "It's gone!" Lady Beatrice cried, her voice trembling with a mixture of disbelief and outrage. "The necklace! My grandmother's necklace! It's gone!" The other guests, drawn by the commotion, crowded into the doorway. Gerald Winthrop, his morning coat slightly rumpled as if he had dressed in haste, looked genuinely startled, though Miss Marple noted a flicker of unease in his eyes that went beyond surprise. Mrs. Clara Pennington, her black shawl drawn tightly around her shoulders, pushed forward with the authority of age, her sharp gaze sweeping the room as if she might spot the thief lurking in a corner. Miss Evelyn Carver, her auburn hair loosely pinned, hovered at the edge of the group, her wide eyes reflecting both curiosity and concern. Stokes, ever the model of composure, stood just inside the room, his hands clasped behind his back, though his jaw was set a fraction tighter than usual. "What do you mean, gone?" Clara demanded, her voice cutting through the murmurs like a knife. "You left it out for any Tom, Dick or Harry to take, didn't you, Beatrice? I warned you about flaunting it." Lady Beatrice, her composure fraying, turned to her aunt with a flash of indignation. "I did no such thing, Clara. It was locked in the case, and the case was in my boudoir. The door was secured last night. I checked it myself." Gerald cleared his throat, stepping forward with a nervous smile. "Surely it's just misplaced, cousin. Perhaps one of the maids moved it while cleaning. Or could a window have been left open? A thief might have slipped in during the night." Miss Marple, standing quietly near the window, glanced at the heavy sash. It was firmly closed, the latch undisturbed, and the frame showed no signs of tampering. She bent slightly, as if to adjust her shawl, and noted the pristine condition of the sill. No dust displaced, no scratches on the wood. Gerald's suggestion, she thought, was plausible, only to someone unfamiliar with the realities of a well-secured manor. Her mind drifted to a case in St. Mary Mead, where a stolen locket had been blamed on an imaginary burglar, only for the culprit to be found much closer to home. Stokes, responding to Gerald's remark, spoke in his measured tone. "All windows and doors were checked last night, sir, as is my custom. The staff can confirm the house was secure. No one entered or left after midnight." Evelyn, her voice soft but clear, ventured a question. "Could it have been taken during the party? There were so many people coming and going, servants, guests. It would have been easy to slip in here unnoticed." Clara turned on her with a withering look. And who, pray, would have the audacity? An outsider, no doubt, with no respect for family property. Her tone left little doubt as to whom she suspected, and Evelyn's cheeks flushed faintly, though she held her ground with a defiant tilt of her chin. Lady Beatrice, regaining some of her poise, shook her head. "No, Evelyn, the case was on the sideboard in the drawing-room until I brought it up myself after dinner. I locked it in here before retiring. No one could have taken it without the key." She patted her pocket, producing a small silver key that glinted in her trembling hand. "And this never left my possession." Miss Marple's eyes followed the key, her mind already turning over possibilities. A locked case, a secure room, and a key that never left its owner's side. Yet the necklace was gone. It was the sort of puzzle that delighted her, not for its complexity, but for what it revealed about human nature. People she knew were rarely as careful as they believed themselves to be. and even the most secure plans had cracks through which greed or desperation could slip. The arrival of Inspector Hargreaves, the local constable, brought a shift in the room's atmosphere. He was a stout man in his late 40s, with a ruddy face and a manner that suggested he preferred straightforward crimes to the subtleties of a manor house theft. His uniform was slightly ill-fitting, and his notebook, produced with a flourish, bore the marks of frequent use. "Right then," he said, his voice booming in the confined space. "Let's have the facts. When was the necklace last seen? And who had access to this room?" Lady Beatrice recounted the events of the previous evening. The necklace's display in the drawing-room, its return to the boudoir, and her discovery of the empty case that morning. Inspector Hargreaves examined the case, his thick fingers tracing the lock, which showed no signs of being forced. He questioned the servants, who confirmed that the boudoir had been locked, and the key in Lady Beatrice's possession. The staff, under Stokes's supervision, had been busy with the party, and none had entered the upper rooms after dinner. Miss Marple, standing unobtrusively by a gilt-framed mirror, listened as the inspector's questions grew repetitive. He was thorough, she granted, but lacked imagination. Her own observations were more subtle. She noted the faint scent of lavender in the room, likely from Lady Beatrice's perfume, and the absence of any clutter that might suggest a hurried search. The dressing table held only a silver hairbrush, a crystal perfume bottle, and a small porcelain dish for pins, nothing out of place. Yet something nagged at her, a detail she couldn't quite place, like a dropped stitch in her knitting. As the inspector moved to question the guests, Miss Marple slipped into the background, her eyes roaming over the group. Gerald, now seated on a velvet stool, fidgeted with his cufflinks, his earlier confidence replaced by a restless energy. Clara, standing ramrod straight, answered the inspector's questions with clipped precision, her disdain for the process evident. Evelyn, perched on the edge of an armchair, offered earnest responses, though her fingers twisted nervously in her lap. Stokes, questioned last, provided a detailed account of the evening's routine, his voice steady, but his eyes avoiding direct contact with the inspectors. Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to the village postmistress, Mrs. Biddle, who had once misplaced a valuable parcel only to find it hidden in plain sight. The necklace, she mused, might not be far from the boudoir, despite appearances. Thieves, in her experience, were often bolder than one expected, relying on misdirection rather than distance. She recalled the way Gerald's gaze had lingered on the empty case, as if searching for something he already knew was missing. Clara's sharp comments, too, hinted at a deeper resentment, perhaps rooted in family history. Evelyn's quick defence of herself suggested innocence, but Miss Marple had known charming people to hide guilty secrets. And Stokes, his impeccable calm, was almost too perfect, like a mask worn too long. Inspector Hargreaves concluded his initial inquiries with a pronouncement that the guests and staff were to remain at Haverford Hall until further notice. "No one leaves," he said firmly, "and no one touches this room. We'll conduct a thorough search of the premises." The guests exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of suspicion settling over them like dust. Lady Beatrice, her face drawn, retired to her sitting-room, while Clara muttered about incompetence and retired to write letters. Gerald suggested a game of cards to lighten the mood, but his forced cheer found no takers. Evelyn wandered to the library, her sketchbook in hand, and Stokes resumed his duties with silent efficiency. Miss Marple returned to the morning room. Her knitting resumed, the soft click of her needles a steady rhythm against the tension of the house. She considered the facts. A locked room, an unforced case, a key that never left its owner, and a necklace worth a fortune. The puzzle was neat, almost too neat, as if designed to mislead. She thought of the village schoolmaster, Mr. Higgins, who had once hidden stolen coins in a hollowed-out book, believing no one would look there. Could the necklace be similarly concealed, waiting for the thief to retrieve it when suspicion waned? As she knitted, Miss Marple's mind sifted through the guests' behaviours. Gerald's financial troubles were no secret. The maids had whispered of his late-night telephone calls, pleading with unseen creditors. Clara's bitterness toward Beatrice suggested old wounds, perhaps tied to the necklace's ownership. Evelyn, though charming, knew more about the house than a first-time guest should, her artist's eye catching details others missed. And Stokes, with his shadowed past, had the means and opportunity to move unnoticed through the manor's corridors. Each had a motive, however faint, and each had something to hide. The morning wore on, the house settling into an uneasy quiet. Miss Marple, her knitting a pretext for observation, watched the comings and goings from her corner. A maid hurried past with a tray, her eyes downcast. A footman lingered near the boudoir's door, as if guarding it from curiosity. And Gerald, pacing the terrace outside, lit a cigarette with shaking hands, his gaze darting toward the upper windows. Miss Marple noted it all, her mind weaving a pattern from the threads of human behaviour. The necklace, she felt certain, was still within reach, and the thief closer still. The challenge, as always, was seeing what others overlooked. Not the grand gestures, but the small telling details that betrayed the heart's secrets. Chapter 3. The Cousin's Burden. The late morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Haverford Hall, casting dappled shadows across the morning room, where Miss Jane Marple sat, her knitting needles moving with their usual quiet rhythm. The house, though still humming with the undercurrent of the stolen necklace, had settled into a fragile calm after the initial uproar. Inspector Hargreaves had retired to the library to interview the servants one by one, his heavy footsteps echoing down the corridor. The guests, left to their own devices, dispersed through the manor, their movements betraying varying degrees of unease. Miss Marple, ever watchful, had chosen her seat strategically, near a window overlooking the terrace where Gerald Winthrop now stood, his silhouette framed against the rose garden. Gerald, Lady Beatrice's cousin, was a man of 40 whose charm had not yet faded, though it was fraying at the edges like the cuffs of his once fine suits. His dark hair was neatly combed, his posture that of a gentleman, but there was a restlessness about him, a nervous energy that Miss Marple recognized from her years observing human nature in St. Mary Mead. She recalled a young man from her village, Eddie Stokes, no relation to the butler, who had fallen into ruin over unpaid debts, his easy smile masking a growing desperation until it led him to pilfer from the church poor box. Gerald, she suspected, was cut from similar cloth, his polished manners a veneer over a life teetering on the edge of collapse. As she knitted, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to a snippet of conversation she had overheard earlier that morning. While passing the drawing room, she had caught Gerald's low, urgent voice speaking to Lady Beatrice. "It's only a temporary setback, Beatrice," he had said, his tone cajoling. "If you could see your way to a small loan, just until the investments come through." Beatrice's reply had been firm, tinged with exasperation. "Gerald, I've helped you before, but my resources aren't limitless. You must settle with those creditors." The exchange had ended abruptly when Stokes entered with a tray, but it lingered in Miss Marple's mind like a loose thread in her knitting. Now, watching Gerald on the terrace, she noted his distracted air. He lit another cigarette, the match flaring briefly in his unsteady hand, and paced in short, agitated steps. His eyes flicked toward the house, then away, as if he feared being observed. Miss Marple, her needles clicking softly, considered what she knew of him. The maids, ever a source of unguarded chatter, had mentioned his late-night habits, pacing the grounds, muttering to himself, once even overheard on the telephone, promising a solution to an unseen listener. Debts, Miss Marple knew, could drive a man to desperate acts, and the sapphire necklace, with its glittering promise of wealth, would be a tempting remedy. She rose, tucking her knitting into her bag, and decided to take a turn about the garden. The air was warm, scented with lavender and freshly cut grass, and the gravel path crunched under her sensible shoes. As she approached the terrace, Gerald turned, his face breaking into a practiced smile. "Miss Marple, isn't it? Enjoying the morning air? It's a fine day, despite all this bother." "Quite fine," she replied, her tone mild but her eyes sharp, "though I imagine it's difficult to enjoy with such a shadow hanging over the house. Poor Beatrice must be terribly distressed." Gerald's smile faltered, and he took a quick drag on his cigarette. "Oh, Beatrice is resilient. She'll weather it. Probably just a misunderstanding. Some servant misplacing the thing, I shouldn't wonder." His words were casual, but his fingers twitched, betraying a tension that belied his nonchalance. Miss Marple nodded, as if accepting his theory. Perhaps, though it's curious, isn't it, how such a valuable item could vanish without a trace? One would think a thief would need time and opportunity to manage it so neatly. She paused, her gaze resting on him with the gentle curiosity of an elderly aunt. "You were in the library last night, I believe. Reading, I suppose, while the rest of us were at dinner." Gerald's eyes narrowed slightly, but he recovered quickly. "Yes, exactly. Couldn't sleep, so I thought a bit of Dickens might do the trick. Stayed up past midnight, I dare say." He gestured vaguely toward the house, as if the library's location somehow validated his claim. "Dickens is always a comfort," Miss Marple said, her voice warm but her mind noting the specificity of his alibi. In St. Mary Mead, she had known a grocer's assistant who swore he was reading Thackeray when a till was robbed, only to be caught out by his ignorance of the book's plot. She made a mental note to check the library later, curious to see if Gerald's choice of reading material held up. As they spoke, a maid emerged from the house, her apron slightly askew, and hurried towards the kitchen garden. Miss Marple recognized her as Polly, a young girl with a nervous habit of twisting her hands when questioned. Earlier, while the inspector was busy, Miss Marple had engaged Polly in a brief conversation about the household routines. The girl had let slip that Gerald had been seen near the stables at an odd hour, long after the party had ended, though she quickly clammed up when pressed for details. Miss Marple, with her knack for coaxing confidences, had not pushed further, but the information lingered in her mind like a clue waiting to be placed. "Tell me, Mr. Winthrop," she said, her tone conversational. "Do you often walk the grounds at night? The gardens here are lovely, even in the dark, I imagine." Gerald's cigarette paused halfway to his lips, and for a moment his face was unguarded, a flicker of alarm crossing his features. "Oh, now and then," he said, recovering with a laugh. "Fresh air helps clear the head, you know, especially when one's got a lot on one's mind." He stubbed out his cigarette with more force than necessary and excused himself, claiming a need to check on his correspondence. Miss Marple watched him go, her expression serene but her thoughts active. Gerald's manner, she decided, was that of a man carrying a burden heavier than he could bear. She recalled a case in her village where a young man, pressed by gambling debts, had stolen a silver candlestick from the vicarage, believing it would save him from ruin. The signs were similar: the forced cheer, the quick deflections, the restless hands. But suspicion, she knew, was not evidence, and Gerald's alibi, if true, placed him far from the boudoir when the necklace vanished. She continued her walk, circling toward the stables where Polly had seen Gerald. The path was lined with neatly trimmed hedges, and the stables themselves were a handsome structure of red brick, their doors open to reveal the quiet snuffling of horses. A stable boy, polishing a bridle, glanced up as she approached. Miss Marple, with her gift for disarming even the most reticent, engaged him in idle chatter about the horses, steering the conversation towards the previous night. "Oh, I saw Mr. Winthrop," the boy admitted, his eyes on his work. "Must have been near 1 in the morning. He was just standing by the gate, looking toward the house. Didn't say nothing, just nodded and went off." The boy shrugged, unaware of the significance of his words, and Miss Marple thanked him with a smile, storing the detail away. Returning to the house, she paused at the library door. The room was dim, its shelves lined with leather-bound volumes that smelled faintly of dust and wax. She scanned the titles, noting a copy of Bleak House slightly askew, as if recently handled. Opening it, she found no telltale signs, no hidden compartments, no scribbled notes. But the book's position suggested someone had indeed been there. Whether it was Gerald, and whether his purpose was innocent, remained to be seen. As she left the library, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the necklace itself. Its value was not merely monetary. It was a symbol of the Haverford legacy, a prize that might tempt someone beyond mere greed. Gerald's debts provided a motive, but motives, she knew, were like threads in a tapestry. Pull one, and others might unravel. Clara's resentment, Evelyn's familiarity with the house, Stokes's guarded demeanour, each was a thread in its own right, waiting to be woven into the truth. She settled back in the morning room. Her knitting resumed as Inspector Hargreaves's voice carried from the library, questioning a housemaid about the night's events. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, her mind as sharp as ever. Gerald Winthrop, with his charm and his burdens, was a man to watch, but she would need more than village parallels to prove his guilt. The necklace, she felt certain, was still close, hidden by a hand that thought itself clever. and Miss Marple, with her quiet ways and unerring eye, was determined to find it. Chapter 4. The Aunt's Secrets. The afternoon light filtered through the heavy drapes of Haverford Hall's drawing-room, casting a soft glow over the polished furniture and the sombre mood that had settled over the household. Miss Jane Marple, seated in a high-backed armchair near the fireplace, worked on her knitting, with the steady rhythm of one accustomed to long hours of observation. The sapphire necklace's disappearance had left the manor in a state of quiet tension, with Inspector Hargreaves's methodical inquiries droning on in the background. The guests confined to the estate moved about with the restlessness of caged birds, their conversations strained and their glances sharp with suspicion. Monsieur Marple, ever unobtrusive, let her eyes wander over the room, her thoughts turning to Mrs. Clara Pennington, Lady Beatrice's formidable aunt. Clara, at 72, was a figure of imposing presence, her black silk dress and severe posture evoking a bygone era of rigid propriety. Her grey eyes, sharp as flint, missed little, and her tongue was sharper still, cutting through pleasantries with the precision of a well-aimed dart. At lunch, she had dominated the conversation, her remarks laced with barbs aimed at Gerald's fecklessness and Evelyn's modern ways. But it was her comments about the necklace that lingered in Miss Marple's mind, delivered with a bitterness that hinted at deeper grievances. "That necklace," Clara had said, her voice low but venomous, "should never have gone to Beatrice. It was meant for the elder line, my line." Miss Marple, sipping tea in the drawing-room, had invited Clara to join her, sensing an opportunity to probe the old lady's sentiments. Clara accepted with a regal nod, settling into a chair with the air of one granting an audience. "You're a sensible woman, Miss Marple," she began, her tone implying this was a rare compliment. "You must see how reckless Beatrice is, flaunting that necklace as if it were a trinket. It's a family heirloom, not a bauble for display." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of sympathetic agreement. "It is a remarkable piece," she said, her needles clicking softly. "You seem to know a great deal about its history. Was it truly meant for your side of the family?" Her question was gentle, but her eyes, bright and attentive, watched Clara's face for any flicker of unguarded truth. Clara's lips tightened, and for a moment her gaze drifted to the empty sideboard where the necklace's case had been displayed the previous evening. "My mother was the eldest daughter," she said, her voice clipped. "By rights, the necklace should have passed to her and then to me. But Beatrice's grandfather, my cousin, persuaded the family otherwise. A matter of sentiment, they called it. Sentiment!" She snorted, her hands folding tightly in her lap. "Beatrice treats it like a toy, not a legacy." Miss Marple, recalling a similar dispute in St. Mary Mead over a contested family Bible, noted the resentment in Clara's tone. It was not merely about the necklace's ownership, she sensed, but a deeper wound, perhaps tied to years of being overlooked in favour of Beatrice's branch of the family. Envy, she knew, could fester into something more dangerous, much like the case of old Mrs. Harrow, who had sabotaged her sister's garden out of spite over an inherited rosewood table. Could Clara's bitterness have driven her to take the necklace, if only to reclaim what she felt was hers? Yet Clara's physical limitations gave Miss Marple pause. The boudoir where the necklace was kept was on the second floor, and Clara's arthritis, evident in her stiff movements and reliance on a silver-topped cane, made climbing stairs a laborious task. Miss Marple had observed her earlier, navigating the grand staircase with slow, deliberate steps, a maid hovering nearby. Stealing into the boudoir, undetected, especially at night, would require agility Clara seemed to lack. Still, Miss Marple knew better than to dismiss a suspect based on appearances alone. In her village, a frail widow had once orchestrated a theft by proxy, her cunning undiminished by her years. To test her theory, Miss Marple steered the conversation to the night of the theft. "It must be distressing," she said, her tone all concern, "to think someone in this house could be so bold. The boudoir is so close to your rooms, isn't it? Did you hear anything unusual last night?" Clara's eyes narrowed, as if sensing a trap, but she answered readily. "My rooms are indeed nearby, but I sleep soundly, Miss Marple. I heard nothing, no footsteps, no creaking doors. Whoever took it was clever. I'll grant them that. Or lucky." Her voice held a trace of grudging admiration, but her gaze was steady, offering no hint of guilt. Miss Marple nodded, filing away the response. Clara's rooms, she recalled, were just down the corridor from the boudoir, a fact that placed her conveniently close to the scene of the crime. Yet her claim of sleeping soundly was plausible, and the absence of noise suggested a thief who knew the house well enough to move silently. Clara's knowledge of Haverford was unmatched. She had visited often in her youth, as she had mentioned at dinner, and her memory for its quirks was sharp. Could she have planned the theft? Perhaps enlisting an accomplice to overcome her physical limitations? Miss Marple thought of the housemaid Polly, who seemed nervous around Clara, as if accustomed to her sharp commands. As Clara excused herself to write letters, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the necklace's history, which Clara had recounted with such fervour. It had been a gift to a Haverford ancestor from a French nobleman. Its sapphires rumoured to carry a curse, a fanciful detail, Miss Marple suspected, but one that added to its mystique. Clara's fixation on its rightful ownership suggested a motive rooted in pride, not greed, but pride could be as potent a spur as money. Miss Marple recalled a St. Mary Mead spinster who had stolen a rival's heirloom brooch, not for its value, but to settle an old score. Clara, with her rigid sense of entitlement, might well harbour a similar grudge. To gather more information, Miss Marple took a turn through the upper corridor, pausing outside Clara's rooms. The door was ajar, and she glimpsed the old lady seated at a writing desk, her pen moving with brisk precision. A small photograph on the desk caught Miss Marple's eye. A faded image of a young Clara, wearing a necklace that bore a striking resemblance to the stolen one. The resemblance was not exact, but it suggested Clara's attachment to the family's legacy was more personal than she let on. Miss Marple made a mental note to inquire further, perhaps through Lady Beatrice, about the necklace's provenance. Descending to the drawing-room, Miss Marple encountered Evelyn Carver, who was sketching idly on a pad, her auburn hair catching the light. The young artist looked up with a smile, but her eyes were wary, as if she sensed the weight of suspicion. "Miss Marple," she said, "you seem awfully calm amidst all this chaos. Don't you find it unsettling, being trapped here with a thief?" Miss Marple smiled, her needles resuming their rhythm. "Oh, my dear, I've seen my share of little mysteries. People are rarely as mysterious as they think. Tell me, did you notice Mrs. Pennington last night? She seemed so particular about the necklace. Evelyn's pencil paused, and she tilted her head. Clara? Oh, she was in fine form, wasn't she? All that talk about family honour. I think she resents Beatrice for having what she doesn't. But steal it? She can barely walk without that cane. Evelyn's tone was light, but Miss Marple caught a flicker of calculation in her gaze, as if she were deflecting attention. Quite so, Miss Marple said, her voice gentle. Though resentment can be a powerful thing, don't you think? It makes people do the most unexpected things. She left the comment hanging, her eyes meeting Evelyn's for a moment before returning to her knitting. As Evelyn excused herself, Miss Marple's thoughts circled back to Clara. That old lady's bitterness was clear, but her means were uncertain. An accomplice, perhaps, or a clever ruse to hide her involvement. Miss Marple recalled a case in her village where an elderly woman had used her apparent frailty to deflect suspicion, orchestrating a theft through a loyal servant. Clara, with her commanding presence, could easily bend a nervous maid like Polly to her will. Yet the lack of physical evidence, footprints, disturbed objects, suggested a thief with finesse, not force. The afternoon wore on, and Miss Marple remained in the drawing-room, her knitting a pretext for observation. She watched as Clara descended the stairs, her cane tapping rhythmically, her face set in a mask of disapproval. The old lady's eyes met hers briefly, and Miss Marple saw in them a glint of defiance, as if daring her to uncover the truth. Clara Pennington, she decided, was a woman with secrets. And secrets in Miss Marple's experience were the threads that unravelled even the tightest of knots. Chapter 5. The Butler's Shadow. The late afternoon light cast long shadows across the polished floors of Haverford Hall, lending an air of solemnity to the manor as the investigation into the stolen sapphire necklace continued. Miss Jane Marple, seated in a quiet corner of the library, her knitting needles moving with their familiar, soothing rhythm, observed the household with her usual unobtrusive care. The tension that had gripped the guests since morning had not abated. If anything, it had deepened, each glance and whispered word laced with suspicion. Inspector Hargreaves, having exhausted his initial round of questions, was now methodically searching the servants' quarters, his heavy tread audible even from the library's hushed confines. Miss Marple's thoughts, however, were fixed on a figure who moved through the house with the silent efficiency of a shadow. Mr. Reginald Stokes, the butler. Stokes was a man of middle age, his lean frame clad in immaculate black, his face a study in professional detachment. His movements were precise, his speech measured, and his presence so seamless that he seemed to blend into the very walls of Haverford Hall. Yet Miss Marple, with her keen eye for the subtleties of human behaviour, sensed something beneath his polished exterior, a guardedness that hinted at secrets carefully kept. She recalled a butler in St. Mary Mead, Mr. Grayson, who had served a grand family with similar decorum, only to be revealed as the orchestrator of a smuggling ring, his quiet authority masking a web of deceit. Stokes, she thought, warranted closer scrutiny. Her opportunity came as she lingered in the dining room after tea, where Stokes was overseeing the clearing of the silver. The table gleamed under his meticulous care, each piece polished to a mirror-like shine. Miss Marple, her knitting bag at her side, approached with a disarming smile. "You keep a splendid house, Mr. Stokes," she said, her tone warm and admiring. It must take a great deal of skill to manage everything so smoothly, especially with all this upheaval. Stokes inclined his head, his expression unchanging. "Thank you, madam. It is my duty to ensure the household runs as it should, regardless of circumstances." His voice was smooth, almost too smooth, like a well-rehearsed line delivered to deflect curiosity. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes resting on the silver candelabra he was inspecting. Quite so, and such a large house, with so many doors and passages. It must be a challenge to keep track of everything. I suppose you know every lock and key by heart. For a fraction of a second, Stokes's fingers paused on the candelabra, a hesitation so brief it might have gone unnoticed by anyone less observant. "I am familiar with the manor's security, yes," he replied, his tone as even as ever. "All doors and windows are checked nightly, and the keys are accounted for. The boudoir, where the necklace was kept, is particularly secure." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she considered his words. His knowledge of the house was undeniable, and his role gave him access to places others might not reach unnoticed. The boudoir's lock, Lady Beatrice had insisted, was intact, and the key had never left her possession. Yet Stokes, as butler, would know the routines of the household intimately. When rooms were empty, when servants were occupied, when a moment of opportunity might arise. She recalled a case in her village where a gardener, trusted for years, had used his knowledge of back doors to steal a silver tray. Could Stokes have done the same, slipping into the boudoir under the guise of his duties? To test her theory, she steered the conversation towards the night of the theft. "It must have been a busy evening for you," she said, her voice all innocence. "With the party in full swing, I imagine you were everywhere at once. Were you in the upper rooms at all, checking on things?" Stokes met her gaze, his eyes cool and unreadable. "I remained in the lower rooms, madam, attending to the guests' needs. After dinner, I was in the servants' hall, overseeing the staff. They can confirm my whereabouts." His answer was precise, almost rehearsed, and Miss Marple noted the way he emphasized the servant's confirmation, as if aware it would be checked. She thanked him and moved to the window, pretending to admire the view of the rose garden. Her mind, however, was elsewhere, sifting through a chance remark she had overheard from a footman earlier that day. The young man, flustered by the inspector's questions, had mentioned that Stokes had once worked for a family in Kent, whose silver had vanished under mysterious circumstances. No blame had fallen on Stokes, but the coincidence lingered in Miss Marple's thoughts, like a faint but persistent scent. She knew from experience that past shadows often cast light on present deeds, much like the case of a saint. Mary Mead Postman, whose prior indiscretions had resurfaced when a parcel went missing. Later, as she took a turn through the servants' quarters under the pretext of fetching a shawl, Miss Marple engaged the housekeeper, Mrs. Ellis, in conversation. Mrs. Ellis, a stout woman with a no-nonsense air, was fiercely loyal to Stokes, praising his efficiency and discretion. "He's been with us 3 years, and never a fault," she said, folding linens with brisk movements. But when Miss Marple gently inquired about Stokes's previous employment, Mrs. Ellis's hand slowed, and her lips pressed into a thin line. "He came highly recommended," she said curtly. "Some talk about his last place, but nothing proven. Gossip, that's all." Miss Marple did not press further, but the housekeeper's defensiveness was telling. She recalled a saint, Mary Mead Cook, who had defended her nephew's innocence with similar fervour, only for the boy to confess to pilfering from the pantry. Loyalty, Miss Marple knew, could blind even the sharpest eyes to the truth. Stokes's past, though unproven, suggested a pattern. A man who moved through grand houses, leaving whispers of suspicion in his wake. Returning to the library, Miss Marple settled into a chair near a shelf of leather-bound volumes, her knitting a pretext for lingering. She watched as Stokes passed through the hall, carrying a tray with a decanter of sherry. His assumed movements were fluid, almost invisible. A man trained to be seen only when needed. Yet she noticed a slight stiffness in his posture, as if he felt the weight of unseen eyes. Could he have taken the necklace, using his knowledge of the house to slip into the boudoir, undetected? The servants' hall, where he claimed to have been, was not far from the back stairs, which led directly to the upper corridor. A skilled man could move quickly, leaving no trace. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the mechanics of the theft. The boudoir's lock was unforced, the key in Lady Beatrice's possession. Stokes, as butler, might have access to spare keys or the means to procure one. A skeleton key, perhaps, or a duplicate made in a moment of opportunity. She recalled a village locksmith who had once crafted such a key for a dishonest footman. A small act that unravelled a larger crime. Stokes's alibi, supported by the staff, was strong, but Miss Marple knew alibis could be arranged, especially by someone with authority over others. As evening approached, she observed Stokes at dinner, where he served with his usual precision, his face a mask of professionalism. Yet when Lady Beatrice mentioned the necklace, his hand faltered slightly, a wine glass tilting just enough to catch the candlelight. It was a fleeting moment, but Miss Marple's eyes missed nothing. She thought of the saint, Mary Mead Vicar's assistant, whose nervous twitch had betrayed his guilt over a stolen collection plate. Stokes, she decided, was a man worth watching, his calm exterior perhaps concealing a shadow that stretched further than anyone suspected. The dinner conversation turned to the investigation, with Gerald suggesting a professional thief from outside, and Clara insisting the culprit was among them. Evelyn, quieter than usual, offered a hesitant theory about a servant acting under duress, her eyes flicking toward Stokes for the briefest moment. Miss Marple, her needles clicking, noted the glance, wondering if Evelyn's intuition was sharper than she let on. Stokes, for his part, remained silent, his face impassive as he refilled glasses. As the guests dispersed, Miss Marple lingered in the dining room, her thoughts circling Stokes. His past, his access, his composure, all pointed to a man capable of the theft, yet the lack of concrete evidence kept her from certainty. She recalled a saying from her village, "Still waters run deep," and Stokes, with his quiet efficiency, was as still as they came. The necklace, she felt, was closer than anyone thought, and the butler's shadow, however faint, might yet lead her to it. Chapter 6. The Guest's Charm. The evening shadows lengthened across Haverford Hall, softening the edges of the manor's grand rooms as the second day of the necklace's disappearance drew to a close. Miss Jane Marple, ensconced in a cushioned window seat in the morning room, her knitting needles clicking with their ceaseless rhythm, watched the play of Light on the Lawn Beyond. The household, though outwardly composed, simmered with unease, the guests' polite exchanges masking a growing web of suspicion. Inspector Hargreaves had spent the day combing through the servants' quarters, his questions yielding little but muttered complaints from the staff. Miss Marple's attention, however, had turned to the youngest and most vibrant of the guests. Miss Evelyn Carver, the artist whose easy charm and quick wit stood in stark contrast to the manor's sombre mood. Evelyn, in her late 20s, was a striking figure, her auburn hair catching the candlelight like a flame, her movements fluid and unself-conscious. Her laughter had been a bright note during Lady Beatrice's birthday celebration, and even now, with suspicion hanging heavy, she maintained an air of buoyant confidence. Yet Miss Marple, with her knack for seeing beyond surface pleasantries, sensed a calculated quality to Evelyn's charm, like a well-painted canvas that hid its underdrawings. In St. Mary Mead, she had known a young actress, Lily Carter, whose radiant smile had concealed a penchant for petty theft, her charm disarming suspicion until the truth emerged. Evelyn, Miss Marple thought, warranted a closer look. Her opportunity came as she wandered into the conservatory, where Evelyn sat sketching by the light of a tall window. The room was a jungle of ferns and exotic blooms, their scent mingling with the faint tang of charcoal from Evelyn's pencils. She looked up as Miss Marple approached, her smile warm but her eyes alert. "Miss Marple, you've caught me at work," she said, holding up her sketchbook to reveal a delicate drawing of the manor's facade. "I find drawing calms the nerves, don't you? All this business with the necklace is positively Gothic." Miss Marple settled onto a wicker chair, her knitting bag at her side. "It is rather unsettling," she agreed, her tone mild. "But your sketches are lovely, my dear. You have a keen eye for detail. I suppose an artist notices things others might miss, like the layout of a house, perhaps, or the habits of its occupants." Evelyn's pencil paused, a flicker of wariness crossing her face before her smile returned. "Oh, I do love old houses like this one," she said lightly. "So many nooks and crannies, each with its own story. But I'm just a guest here, Miss Marple. I barely know my way around." She laughed, a bright, practiced sound, and turned the page to start a new sketch. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, her eyes soft but searching. Evelyn's familiarity with the manor had struck her as unusual from the start. At dinner the previous evening, the young artist had navigated the maze of corridors with ease, commenting on the placement of a portrait as if she had studied the house before. When questioned, she had mentioned visiting similar estates for her art, sketching their architecture for commissions. Yet Haverford Hall was no public gallery, and Miss Marple wondered how Evelyn had come to know it so well. In her village, a young man claiming to be a surveyor had once used his work as a pretext to case houses for burglary. Could Evelyn's artistic pursuits mask a similar intent? To probe further, Miss Marple steered the conversation toward the night of the theft. "You were so lively at the party," she said, her voice warm with admiration. "I recall you dancing with Mr. Winthrop. Such a charming pair you made. Did you stay long in the drawing-room after the necklace was shown? It was such a splendid piece." Evelyn's hand tightened slightly on her pencil, though her expression remained bright. "Oh, I admired it as much as anyone," she said, "but steal it? I'd rather paint it than pilfer it, Miss Marple. I was in the drawing-room until the dancing wound down. Then I went to bed. Too much champagne, I'm afraid." She laughed again, but Miss Marple noted the way her eyes darted to the conservatory door, as if checking for eavesdroppers. The alibi was plausible, but Miss Marple's mind turned to a detail from the morning's chaos. When the boudoir was searched, Evelyn's room had been examined as well, revealing nothing but sketchbooks and paintbrushes. Yet one of the maids, in a whispered aside, had mentioned finding a charcoal sketch of the boudoir's interior among Evelyn's things. A curious choice for a guest who claimed little knowledge of the house. Miss Marple recalled a St. Mary Mead seamstress who had sketched her clients' homes under the guise of measuring curtains, only to pass the drawings to a thief. Could Evelyn's sketches serve a similar purpose? To test her theory, Miss Marple rose and strolled to the conservatory's glass wall, pretending to admire the orchids. "You must have sketched many fine houses," she said, her tone conversational. "Have you ever drawn the boudoir? It's such a charming room, with that lovely dressing table." Evelyn's smile faltered for a moment, but she recovered quickly. "The boudoir? No, I haven't had the chance. It's a private space, after all. I stick to the public rooms. Safer that way." She closed her sketchbook with a snap and stood, brushing charcoal from her hands. "I should tidy up before dinner. Excuse me, Miss Marple." As Evelyn left, Miss Marple's thoughts lingered on the young woman's quick deflection. The sketch of the boudoir, if it existed, suggested a familiarity that Evelyn was reluctant to admit. Miss Marple made a mental note to speak with the maid again, perhaps to confirm the drawing's details. She also recalled Evelyn's glance toward Stokes during dinner, when she had suggested a servant acting under duress. Was it a genuine suspicion, or a calculated move to shift blame? Returning to the morning room, Miss Marple settled into her chair. Her knitting resumed. The house was quiet now, save for the distant murmur of Inspector Hargreaves, questioning a footman. She thought of Evelyn's charm, so like that of Lily Carter, whose smiles had disarmed a village until her thefts were uncovered. Evelyn's youth and vivacity made her seem an unlikely thief, but Miss Marple knew better than to trust appearances. The necklace, she felt, was still within the manor's walls, and Evelyn's knowledge of its layout, whether gained through art or guile, made her a piece of the puzzle. As the dinner gong sounded, Miss Marple tucked her knitting away, her mind weaving together the threads of the day's observations. Evelyn Carver, with her bright eyes and deft hands, was a figure of possibility, her charm a potential mask for something deeper. The truth, Miss Marple knew, lay in the small things, the glance, the sketch, the too-quick laugh, and she would watch and wait until those things revealed themselves fully. Chapter 7. A Clue in the Garden. The third morning at Haverford-Hall dawned with a mist that clung to the Sussex countryside, veiling the manor's gardens in a soft silvery haze. Miss Jane Marple, ever an early riser, stood at the edge of the terrace, her shawl drawn close against the chill, her sharp eyes scanning the grounds. The household was subdued, the weight of the missing sapphire necklace pressing on every conversation, every glance. Inspector Hargreaves, dogged but uninspired, had spent the previous day searching rooms and questioning servants, his efforts yielding no trace of the jewel. Miss Marple, however, preferred her own methods, trusting in the quiet observation of small details to unravel what bluster could not. Today, her instincts drew her to the gardens, where she sensed a clue might lie hidden among the roses and neatly trimmed hedges. She descended the stone steps, her sensible shoes crunching on the gravel path, and made her way toward the west side of the manor, where Lady Beatrice's boudoir overlooked a flower-bed of late-blooming roses. The boudoir's window, high and narrow, was framed by ivy, its sash still firmly closed as it had been since the theft. Miss Marple paused, her gaze falling on the earth below. There, half hidden by the thorny branches, was a faint scuff mark in the soil. A shallow indentation, no wider than a man's shoe, as if someone had stood there briefly and taken care to cover their tracks. The surrounding earth was undisturbed, the gardener's work meticulous, but this mark stood out to her trained eye like a misplaced stitch in a pattern. Kneeling carefully, her shawl brushing the ground, Miss Marple examined the mark. It was fresh, the soil still slightly damp from the morning dew, suggesting it had been made within the last day or two. She glanced up at the window, noting its height, too high for an easy climb, but not impossible for someone agile or determined. The latch, visible through the glass, showed no signs of tampering, yet the mark suggested someone had lingered here, perhaps studying the room or planning an entry. In St. Mary Mead, she had once solved a case of stolen apples by noticing a similar mark beneath an orchard wall, left by a boy who thought himself clever. This clue, she felt, was no less significant. Rising, she brushed the soil from her hands and continued her circuit of the garden, her mind turning over possibilities. Gerald Winthrop's late-night pacing, mentioned by the stable boy, placed him near the grounds at an odd hour. Could he have stood here, plotting to reach the boudoir? Stokes, the butler, with his intimate knowledge of the manor's layout, might have used the garden as a vantage point, his silent movements unnoticed by the sleeping household. Even Evelyn, with her artist's eye for detail, could have studied the window while sketching the manor's facade. Clara, however, seemed an unlikely candidate. Her arthritis would make navigating the uneven ground a challenge, let alone standing long enough to leave a mark. Miss Marple approached the gardener, a wiry man named Mr. Hawkins, who was pruning a hedge near the stables. With her usual disarming charm, she engaged him in conversation about the roses, gradually steering the topic to the flower-bed beneath the boudoir. "Such lovely blooms," she said, her voice warm. "Have you tended that bed recently? It looks so pristine, almost untouched." Hawkins, wiping sweat from his brow, shook his head. "Not in days, ma'am. Been busy with the hedges and the orchard. No one's been near that bed since the party, far as I know." His tone was matter-of-fact, but Miss Marple noted his certainty, a detail that ruled out routine gardening as the source of the mark. Thanking him, she returned to the house, her thoughts circling the scuff mark like a needle threading a loop. She recalled a case in her village where a thief had left a similar trace beneath a window, believing it would go unnoticed. The mark at Haverford suggested intent, a moment of reconnaissance, perhaps, before the theft. But how had the thief entered the boudoir? The locked door, the unforced case, and Lady Beatrice's key all pointed to an inside job. Yet the garden clue hinted at an external approach, or at least the pretense of one. In the morning room, Miss Marple settled into her usual chair. Her knitting resumed as she watched the household stir. Gerald was absent, reportedly nursing a headache, but Clara sat stiffly by the fire, her cane tapping impatiently as she dictated a letter to a maid. Evelyn, sketching in a corner, glanced up occasionally, her expression thoughtful. Stokes moved through the room, adjusting a vase with his usual precision, his face a mask of calm. Miss Marple, her needles clicking, considered mentioning the scuff mark to Inspector Hargreaves, but decided against it. The inspector, with his penchant for loud pronouncements, might trample the clue's significance. Instead, she resolved to keep it to herself, a small piece of the puzzle to be fitted later. Luncheon. The conversation turned inevitably to the theft. Clara, her voice sharp, suggested the necklace had been smuggled out of the house, perhaps by a servant in league with an outsider. Evelyn countered that the thief might still have it, hidden somewhere clever. Gerald, joining the table late, looked pale but forced a smile, agreeing with Evelyn's theory while avoiding her gaze. Miss Marple, eating her soup with delicate care, noted the dynamics, Clara's accusations, Evelyn's quick theories, Gerald's unease. Stokes, serving silently, seemed to listen more intently than his role required. After the meal, Miss Marple approached Inspector Hargreaves, who was reviewing his notes in the library. "I wonder," she said, her tone diffident, "if you've looked at the garden beneath the boudoir window. The ground there might hold some interest." Hargreaves frowned, his pencil pausing. "The garden?" "We checked the windows. Nothing tampered with. Probably just the gardener's work." He dismissed the idea with a wave, but Miss Marple's mild smile hid her disappointment. She had hoped he might see the value of the clue, but his focus remained on doors and keys, not the subtler traces of human intent. Returning to the garden, Miss Marple stood once more by the flower-bed, her eyes tracing the scuff mark's outline. It was a small thing, easily overlooked, but to her it was a whisper of the thief's presence, a moment of hesitation perhaps, or calculation. She thought of Gerald's restless pacing, Stokes's silent efficiency, Evelyn's observant gaze. Each could have stood here, their motives as varied as the roses around them. The necklace, she felt certain, was still within the manner's reach. And this mark was a thread in the tapestry of the truth, waiting to be pulled. As she turned back to the house, her shawl catching on a thorn, Miss Marple's mind was alight with possibilities. The clue in the garden was a beginning, not an end, and she would follow it, as she always did, with the patience of one who knew that small things often led to great revelations. Chapter 8. The Hidden Motive. The air in Haverford-Hall grew heavier as the third day of the sapphire necklace's disappearance wore on, the mist of the morning giving way to a pale, unyielding sunlight that seemed to sharpen the edges of every suspicion. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the drawing-room with her knitting, observed the guests with her usual quiet acuity, her needles moving in a rhythm that belied the quickness of her thoughts. The scuff mark in the garden had added a new thread to the tapestry of the mystery, but it was the undercurrents of human motive, greed, pride, desperation, that drew her focus now. The household, confined by Inspector Hargreaves's orders, had become a stage where each player's mask slipped, revealing glimpses of their true selves. Miss Marple's attention, sharpened by years of village intrigues, settled on Gerald Winthrop, whose restless demeanour and whispered debts suggested a man teetering on the edge of ruin. Dinner that evening was a strained affair. The clink of silverware and the murmur of forced pleasantries filling the dining room. Lady Beatrice, pale but composed, presided at the head of the table, her eyes occasionally drifting to the empty sideboard where the necklace's case had once stood. Clara Pennington, her black shawl drawn tightly, sat with the rigidity of a judge, her comments laced with pointed barbs. "Beatrice, you should have locked that case in a safe," she said, her voice cutting through the hum of conversation. "Flaunting it invited trouble. Mark my words, it's someone in this house, someone with no respect for our family's name." Gerald, seated across from her, flushed, his fork pausing mid-air. "Really, Clara, that's a bit much," he said, his tone striving for levity but betraying irritation. "You make it sound as if we're all plotting against Beatrice. I'd wager it was some clever outsider, slipping in while we were all distracted by the party." His eyes flicked to Evelyn Carver, who was quietly buttering a roll, as if seeking her agreement. Evelyn looked up, her auburn hair glinting in the candlelight, and offered a small smile. "I don't know, Gerald. An outsider would need to know the house awfully well to pull it off without a trace. It feels personal somehow." Her voice was soft, but Miss Marple caught the way her gaze lingered on Gerald, a hint of challenge in her eyes. Miss Marple, eating her fish with delicate precision, noted the exchange. Gerald's quick deflection, Clara's accusations, Evelyn's subtle probing, all were pieces of the puzzle, each revealing a facet of the tension that bound them. She recalled a St. Mary Mead dinner where a farmer's wife had accused her neighbour of theft, only for the true culprit, a family member, to betray himself with a nervous laugh. Gerald's unease, she thought, was more than mere discomfort. It was the strain of a man carrying a secret too heavy to conceal for long. After dinner, as the guests retired to the drawing-room, Miss Marple lingered in the hall, her knitting bag in hand, her ears attuned to the sounds of the house. She heard the faint creak of a floorboard and the low murmur of a voice from the library. Moving silently, she paused near the door, which stood slightly ajar. Gerald was inside, speaking on the telephone, his voice low and urgent. "I'll have it sorted by Monday, I swear," he said, his tone edged with desperation. No, don't do that. Just give me a few more days. It's under control." The call ended abruptly, and Miss Marple stepped back, her face serene but her mind racing. The conversation confirmed what she had suspected. Gerald's debts were not merely a rumour, but a pressing reality, a noose tightening around him. In St. Mary Mead, she had known a shopkeeper, Mr. Tuttle, who had stolen from his own till to appease creditors, his charm crumbling under the weight of his promises. Gerald, with his polished manners and strained smiles, was walking a similar path. The sapphire necklace, worth a fortune, would be a lifeline to a man in such straits. But how had he managed it? The boudoir's lock was unforced, the key in Lady Beatrice's possession, and Gerald's alibi placed him in the library. Yet the scuff mark in the garden suggested he had been near the boudoir's window. Miss Marple returned to the drawing-room, where Clara was holding court, her voice sharp as she recounted the necklace's history to Evelyn. "It was my mother's by right," she said, her eyes glinting. "Beatrice's grandfather stole it for his line, and now look, lost through carelessness." Evelyn nodded politely, but Miss Marple noted her distraction. her fingers twisting a napkin as if wrestling with her own thoughts. Stokes, serving coffee, moved with his usual precision, but his eyes flicked to Gerald as he entered, pale and distracted. Seizing a moment, Miss Marple approached Gerald, her manner all gentle concern. "You look tired, Mr. Winthrop," she said, her needles pausing. "This business with the necklace must be weighing on everyone. I suppose you've had no chance to enjoy the library's quiet since that night?" Gerald started, his hand jerking slightly as he reached for his coffee. "Oh, the library? Yes, it's a fine spot. I was there quite late, as I said. Dickens, you know, keeps the mind off things." His laugh was hollow, and Miss Marple's mild gaze held his for a moment, noting the sweat beading at his temple despite the cool room. "Quite so," she said, her voice warm, "though I imagine it's hard to focus with so much on one's mind. Debts, for instance, can be such a burden." The word was softly spoken, but Gerald's cup rattled in its saucer, and he excused himself with a muttered apology, claiming a need for air. Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, her thoughts weaving together the day's observations. Gerald's telephone call, his nervous demeanour, the scuff mark in the garden, all pointed to a man driven by desperation. She recalled a saint, Mary Mead jeweller, who had taught her how small, valuable items could be hidden in plain sight. A ring tucked into a seam, a brooch slipped into a pocket. The necklace, she suspected, was not far, perhaps concealed in a place Gerald thought safe until he could retrieve it. The library, with its hollowed-out books, came to mind, but she dismissed it as too obvious for a man of Gerald's cunning. As the evening drew to a close, Miss Marple watched the guests disperse, each carrying their own secrets. Clara's bitterness, Evelyn's wariness, Stokes's guarded calm. All were threads in the mystery, but Gerald's motive burned brightest. The necklace, she felt certain, was his doing, a desperate act to stave off ruin. Yet proof remained elusive, and Miss Marple knew that patience, not haste, would reveal the truth. She tucked her knitting away, her mind as sharp as the needle she wielded, ready to unravel the next knot in the tapestry of Haverford Hall. Chapter 9. The trap, the fourth day at Haverford Hall, broke with a restless energy, as if the manor itself sensed the nearing climax of the mystery surrounding the stolen sapphire necklace. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the morning room with her knitting, felt the threads of her observations beginning to weave into a pattern. The scuff mark in the garden, Gerald Winthrop's desperate telephone call, Clara Pennington's bitterness, Evelyn Carver's wariness, and Stokes's guarded demeanour, all pointed to a truth hidden just beneath the surface. Yet suspicion, Miss Marple knew, was not enough. The thief needed to be caught in a moment of indiscretion, and for that a subtle trap was required. In St. Mary Mead, she had once flushed out a pilferer of church funds by suggesting a second collection, watching the guilty party squirm. A similar strategy, she decided, might work here. After breakfast, Miss Marple sought out Lady Beatrice, who was in her sitting room, her face etched with worry. The older woman's hands twisted a lace handkerchief, her usual poise fraying under the strain of the theft. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice low, "this business is unbearable. The inspector seems no closer to finding my necklace, and I feel the eyes of everyone upon me, judging my carelessness." Miss Marple, her expression all sympathy, patted Lady Beatrice's hand. "My dear, It's a trying time, but I've an idea that might help. In my village, we once recovered a lost brooch by announcing a thorough search, publicly, with everyone present. It puts pressure on the guilty, you see, and sometimes they betray themselves in their haste to cover their tracks. Lady Beatrice's eyes brightened, a flicker of hope breaking through her distress. Do you think it could work? Oh, anything to end this nightmare. What should I do? Gather the guests and staff, Miss Marple said, her tone calm but firm. Announce that Inspector Hargreaves will conduct a second, meticulous search of the house this afternoon, starting with the public rooms and moving to the private ones. Make it clear no corner will be overlooked. Then watch, my dear. Watch their faces, their hands. Guilt has a way of showing itself under scrutiny. Lady Beatrice nodded, her resolve strengthening, and she rang for Stokes to arrange the gathering. Miss Marple returned to the morning room. Her knitting resumed, her eyes alert for the reactions her plan would provoke. She recalled a St. Mary Mead grocer who, faced with a rumoured inventory check, had hidden stolen goods in a flour bin, only to be caught retrieving them. The necklace, she suspected, was still in the house, and its thief, likely Gerald, given his desperation, might be tempted to move it under the threat of exposure. At noon, Lady Beatrice assembled the household in the drawing-room. The guests stood in a tense semicircle. Gerald, his hands thrust deep into his pockets, his smile strained. Clara, her cane tapping impatiently, her eyes sharp with disapproval. Evelyn, clutching her sketchbook, her expression a mix of curiosity and unease, and Stokes, standing at the edge, his face as impassive as ever. The servants lined up behind whispered among themselves, their glances darting nervously. Inspector Hargreaves, looking slightly put out at the suggestion of more work, stood beside Lady Beatrice as she spoke. "My friends, my staff," Lady Beatrice began, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "This theft has cast a shadow over us all. To put an end to it, Inspector Hargreaves will conduct a thorough search of the house this afternoon, leaving no room unchecked. I ask for your cooperation, as I cannot rest until my grandmother's necklace is found." A murmur rippled through the group. Gerald's jaw tightened, and he shifted his weight, his eyes flicking toward the library door. Clara snorted, muttering about foolish theatrics, but her grip on her cane tightened. Evelyn's fingers brushed the edge of her sketchbook, as if seeking comfort, while Stokes remained still, though Miss Marple noted a faint tightening of his lips. The servants exchanged glances, their whispers growing hushed. Miss Marple, seated near the window, her knitting needles clicking, watched each reaction like a hawk studying its prey. As the group dispersed, Miss Marple lingered, her gaze fixed on Gerald. He excused himself quickly, claiming a need to fetch a book, and headed toward the library. She followed at a discreet distance, her steps light despite her years, her shawl blending with the shadows of the corridor. The library was a cavern of bookshelves, its air heavy with the scent of leather and old paper. Gerald stood near a shelf, his back to the door, his movements quick and furtive. Miss Marple, pausing just outside, saw him pull a volume from the shelf, a worn copy of Pride and Prejudice, and open it with trembling hands. She stepped forward, her voice soft but clear. "A fine choice, Mr. Winthrop. I've always enjoyed Miss Austen. Is there something particular at that book that interests you? Gerald started, nearly dropping the book, and turned to face her, his face pale. "Miss Marple, I was just looking for something to read. This caught my eye." His laugh was forced, and he clutched the book tightly, as if shielding it. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with gentle curiosity. "May I see? I do love a well-loved book." Before he could protest, she reached out, her movements deceptively swift for her age, and took the volume. As she opened it, a hollowed-out compartment revealed itself. The pages cut away to form a small cavity. Nestled within, the sapphire necklace gleamed, its stones catching the dim light like captured stars. A gasp escaped Gerald, and he staggered back, his hands raised as if to ward off the truth. Miss Marple, her expression calm, called softly for Inspector Hargreaves, who was passing in the hall. The inspector, alerted by her tone, hurried in, his eyes widening at the sight of the necklace. "Good Lord," he muttered, seizing the book. "What's this, then?" Gerald's face crumpled, his charm dissolving into panic. I don't know how it got there," he stammered. "Someone must have planted it. I was just looking for a book, I swear." Miss Marple's needles, now still, lay in her lap as she regarded him with quiet pity. "It's a clever hiding place, Mr. Winthrop," she said softly, "but not quite clever enough. Books are such personal things, aren't they? They tell so much about their owners." Her tone was kind, but her words carried the weight of certainty. Inspector Hargreaves, recovering from his surprise, summoned Stokes and the other guests. As they gathered, the necklace was displayed, its presence drawing gasps and murmurs. Clara's eyes narrowed, her lips pursing in triumph, while Evelyn's hand flew to her mouth, her shock genuine. Stokes's face remained unreadable, though his eyes flicked to Gerald with a flicker of something, disdain perhaps, or relief. Miss Marple, stepping back, let the inspector take charge, her role in the trap complete. She thought of a saint, Mary Mead widow, who had hidden stolen earrings in a teapot, believing them safe until a neighbour's suggestion of a search flushed her out. Gerald, she knew, had been driven by desperation, his debts a noose he could not escape. The trap had worked, not by force, but by the simple pressure of scrutiny, revealing what he could not conceal. As the library filled with voices, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her mind already turning to the confession that would follow. The necklace was found, but the why and how of its theft remained, and she would listen, as always, for the truth in the words that came next. Chapter 10. The Confession. The discovery of the sapphire necklace in the hollowed-out copy of Pride and Prejudice sent a ripple of shock through Haverford Hall, transforming the library into a stage where truth could no longer hide. Miss Jane Marple, standing quietly to one side, her knitting needles still for the moment, observed the scene with her usual clarity, her mild blue eyes missing nothing. The guests and staff, summoned by Inspector Hargreaves's booming voice, crowded into the room, their faces a tableau of surprise, suspicion, and in some cases, relief. Gerald Winthrop, the centre of this storm, stood frozen near the bookshelf, his earlier charm dissolved into a pallor that spoke of defeat. The necklace, its sapphires glinting coldly in the inspector's hand, was both accusation and evidence. A silent witness to the unravelling of a desperate act. Inspector Hargreaves, holding the book aloft like a trophy, fixed Gerald with a stern gaze. "Mr. Winthrop, he said, his voice heavy with authority. "This is a serious matter. The necklace, hidden in your chosen hiding place, found in your hands. Care to explain yourself?" Gerald's shoulders slumped, and he sank into a leather armchair, his hands covering his face. For a moment, silence hung in the room, broken only by the faint ticking of the mantel clock. Clara Pennington, her cane planted firmly before her, glared with a mixture of triumph and disdain. "I knew it," she muttered, loud enough for all to hear. "A wastrel, through and through." Evelyn Carver, clutching her sketchbook, looked at Gerald with wide eyes, her expression torn between pity and disbelief. Stokes, standing near the door, maintained his impeccable composure, though his fingers twitched slightly, betraying a flicker of unease. Miss Marple, her knitting bag at her side, watched Gerald closely. She recalled a young man in St. Mary Mead, Tommy Blake, who had stolen from his employer's till to cover gambling debts, his confession spilling out under the weight of discovery. Gerald, she sensed, was at a similar breaking point, his carefully constructed facade crumbling. She stepped forward, her voice soft but carrying the gentle insistence of one who knew how to coax truth from reluctance. "Mr. Winthrop," she said, "it's best to be honest now. The truth has a way of coming out, and it's kinder to speak it yourself." Gerald raised his head, his eyes hollow. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The room stilled, every ear straining to catch his words. "It was the debts, you see. They've been hounding me for months. Creditors, not the sort you can reason with. They threatened things I couldn't bear to think about." He swallowed, his hands trembling. "The necklace was my way out. I thought I could sell it just for a little while and buy it back later. I never meant to keep it." Lady Beatrice, who had entered silently, gasped, her hand rising to her throat. "Gerald, how could you? My grandmother's necklace, our family's legacy." Gerald flinched, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I know, Beatrice. I'm sorry. I was desperate. I thought no one would know. Not right away." Inspector Hargreaves, notebook in hand, pressed forward. "Explain how you did it, Winthrop. The boudoir was locked, the case unforced. How'd you get in?" Gerald took a shaky breath, his words tumbling out as if relieved to be free of their burden. "I watched Beatrice during the party. She was so caught up with the guests I knew she'd leave the key in her purse. It's a habit of hers, leaving it on the sideboard when she's distracted. I took it, just for a moment, and had a wax impression made in the village the day before. I got a duplicate key from a locksmith I know. No questions asked." He paused, his voice cracking. "That night, after everyone was asleep, I used the key to get into the boudoir. The case was easy to open. Beatrice never changed the combination. I took the necklace and hid it in the book. I thought I'd wait a few days, let the search die down, then slip away, to sell it." Miss Marple nodded to herself, her suspicions confirmed. The scuff mark in the garden, she realized, was from Gerald's reconnaissance, likely checking the boudoir window to ensure no one was watching. She recalled a St. Mary Mead carpenter who had used a similar trick, making a key from a stolen impression to pilfer tools. Gerald's plan, though cunning, had been undone by his own nervousness, his need to check the hiding place betraying him when the search was announced. Clara's voice cut through the silence, sharp and unforgiving, disgraceful, To think you'd stoop so low, Gerald, and drag our family's name through the mud." Her cane tapped the floor, punctuating her anger. Evelyn, her voice softer, spoke up. "It's awful, but I almost feel sorry for him. Debts can make people do terrible things." Her eyes met Miss Marple's briefly, as if seeking approval, but Miss Marple's expression remained unreadable, her thoughts on the sincerity of Evelyn's sympathy. Stokes, still by the door, said nothing, but his gaze lingered on Gerald with a flicker of something, contempt perhaps, or relief that suspicion had shifted. Miss Marple noted it, her mind filing away the butler's reaction for later consideration. Even now, with the necklace found, she sensed other secrets lurking in the shadows here of Haverford-Hall. Inspector Hargreaves, satisfied with the confession, snapped his notebook shut. "Right, Mr. Winthrop, you'll come with me. We'll need a formal statement, and then it's for the law to decide." He gestured to a footman to assist, and Gerald rose, his movements mechanical, as if the weight of his actions had drained him of all vitality. Lady Beatrice, tears in her eyes, approached Miss Marple as Gerald was led away. "How did you know," she whispered, "to suggest the search, to watch him so closely?" Miss Marple's smile was gentle, her needles resuming their quiet rhythm. "People are not so different, my dear. Whether in a manor or a village, they act from need or fear or pride, and those things leave traces, if you know where to look. Mr. Winthrop's burden was heavier than he could carry, and it showed in his eyes, his hands, his haste." As the room emptied, Miss Marple remained, her thoughts lingering on the confession. Gerald's desperation had driven him to theft, but the ease with which he had navigated the house, the key, the hiding-place, all spoke of a man who believed himself cleverer than he was. She recalled a saint, Mary Mead widow, who had hidden stolen silver in a teapot, thinking it safe, only to be undone by a neighbour's sharp eyes. Gerald's mistake, like hers, was underestimating the power of observation. The necklace, now returned to Lady Beatrice, lay safely in its case, but Miss Marple knew the ripples of this theft would linger. Clara's triumph, Evelyn's sympathy, Stokes's silence, each held a piece of the manor's story, and though the mystery was solved, Miss Marple's quiet vigilance would not waver until she was certain no other secrets waited to be uncovered. Chapter 11. The Aftermath. The recovery of the sapphire necklace brought a fragile calm to Haverford-Hall, as if the manor itself exhaled after days of holding its breath. The late afternoon light filtered through the tall windows, casting a golden glow over the drawing-room, where Miss Jane Marple sat, her knitting needles moving with their familiar, soothing rhythm. Gerald Winthrop's confession had lifted the veil of suspicion, but the air remained heavy with unspoken tensions. The echoes of betrayal lingering like dust in the corners. The guests, no longer confined by Inspector Hargreaves's orders, moved with a cautious freedom, their interactions marked by a new wariness. Miss Marple, ever observant, watched the subtle shifts in their demeanour, her mind sifting through the final pieces of the puzzle, ensuring no loose threads remained. Lady Beatrice, restored to her role as hostess, presided over tea with a determined grace, though her eyes betrayed the strain of Gerald's betrayal. The necklace, now safely locked in a safe in her private study, was no longer a topic of conversation, but its presence loomed, a reminder of the fragility of trust. Clara Pennington, seated stiffly by the fire, her cane resting against her chair, seemed almost triumphant. Her earlier accusations of Gerald's fecklessness vindicated. Yet Miss Marple noted a softening in her manner, a slight thaw in her usual sharpness, as if the resolution had eased some deeper resentment. "I suppose I should have seen it," Clara said, her voice low as she sipped her tea, addressing no one in particular. "Gerald always had a reckless streak, even as a boy, but to steal from family—" She shook her head, her grey eyes glinting with a mix of scorn and pity. "I only wish I'd spoken up sooner about that necklace. It's caused nothing but trouble." Miss Marple, her needles clicking, nodded sympathetically. "Family heirlooms do carry such weight," she said, her tone gentle. "They stir feelings we might not expect. You spoke so fondly of its history, Mrs. Pennington. Perhaps you felt its loss as keenly as Beatrice." Clara's lips pursed, but she met Miss Marple's gaze with a flicker of acknowledgement. "Perhaps," she admitted, her voice softer. "It should have been mine, you know, by rights. But that's an old story, and I'm too old for grudges." The confession, small though it was a crack in her armour, and Miss Marple filed it away, recalling a St. Mary Mead spinster who had let go of a lifelong feud only when the truth of a theft came to light. Evelyn Carver, seated near a window, with her sketchbook open, seemed quieter than usual, her usual vivacity tempered by the day's events. She had spent the morning sketching a portrait of Lady Beatrice, a gesture of goodwill that had brought a rare smile to the hostess's face. Now, as she added delicate strokes to her drawing, she glanced at Miss Marple, her expression thoughtful. "You're awfully clever, Miss Marple," she said, her voice low to avoid Clara's ears. "I'd never have thought to look in a book. How did you know?" Miss Marple's smile was modest, her eyes twinkling with quiet amusement. "Oh, my dear, it's only a matter of noticing things. People are so much alike wherever you go. A man in trouble, like Mr. Winthrop, will often choose a hiding place that feels personal, like a book he knows well. In my village, we had a similar case. A stolen watch hidden in a Bible, of all places." Evelyn's laugh was soft, but her eyes held a lingering wariness, as if she sensed Miss Marple's gaze saw more than she let on. "Well, I'm glad it's over," she said, returning to her sketch. "This house feels lighter now, don't you think?" Miss Marple nodded, but her thoughts lingered on Evelyn's quick mind and observant nature, wondering if the young artist's sketches held any untold stories. Mr. Reginald Stokes, moving through the room with his customary precision, served tea with a silence that spoke of restored order. His demeanour, as always, was impeccable, yet Miss Marple noted a subtle change, a slight easing in his posture, as if a weight had lifted. She recalled his guarded glance during Gerald's confession, the faint flicker of relief that had crossed his face. Was it merely the resolution of the theft, or something more personal? In St. Mary Mead, a butler had once been cleared of suspicion, only to reveal a smaller, unrelated secret, a forged reference, a hidden debt. Stokes, she suspected, might harbour such a secret, though it seemed unconnected to the necklace. As tea concluded, Lady Beatrice approached Miss Marple, her gratitude evident in her clasped hands. "I cannot thank you enough," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "Your suggestion of the search, it was brilliant. I'd never have thought Gerald capable of such a thing, but you saw through him." Miss Marple's needles paused, and she met Lady Beatrice's gaze with gentle reassurance. "It's not so much seeing through, my dear, as seeing what's there. People show us who they are, if we look closely. Mr. Winthrop was in pain, you see. Debts can twist even a good man's heart. I've seen it before, in my little village." Lady Beatrice nodded, her eyes misting. "I'll press no charges," she said softly. "He's family, after all, and I can't bear to see him ruined. But he'll leave Haverford Hall, and I'll not help him again." Her resolve was firm, tempered by a sadness that Miss Marple understood all too well. As the afternoon faded into evening, the manor settled into a quieter rhythm. Clara retired to her rooms, her letters now filled with the triumph of her suspicions. Evelyn continued her sketching, her portrait of Lady Beatrice taking shape with delicate care. Stokes resumed his duties, his presence as unobtrusive as ever. Miss Marple, her knitting tucked away, took a final turn through the garden, the scuff mark now a fading memory beneath the roses. The necklace was safe, the thief unmasked, but the aftermath, she knew, was as much a part of the story as the crime itself. People, in their flaws and frailties, revealed truths that lingered long after the mystery was solved. Chapter 12. The Return to St. Mary Mead. The morning of Miss Jane Marple's departure from Haverford Hall was crisp and clear. The Sussex countryside bathed in a soft light that promised autumn's approach. The manor, now free of the shadow cast by the stolen sapphire necklace, had regained a semblance of its former serenity, though the echoes of Gerald Winthrop's betrayal lingered in the hushed conversations of the staff and the guarded glances of the remaining guests. Miss Marple, her small suitcase packed and her knitting bag slung over her arm, stood in the hall, bidding farewell to Lady Beatrice, whose gratitude shone in her tired but relieved eyes. "You've done us a great service, Miss Marple," Lady Beatrice said, clasping her hand. "I shall never forget how you saw what we could not. Haverford Hall is in your debt." Her voice was warm, but there was a trace of sadness, a recognition of the family fracture that no recovered jewel could mend. Miss Marple smiled, her expression as gentle as ever. "It was no great cleverness, my dear, only a matter of watching and listening. People are much the same, whether in a grand house like yours or my little village. They carry their troubles with them, and those troubles leave traces if one knows where to look." She patted Lady Beatrice's hand, her touch light but reassuring, as Stokes, ever impeccable, carried her suitcase to the waiting car. Miss Marple took a final glance around the hall. Clara Pennington had left earlier that morning, her parting words to Beatrice a mix of admonishment and reluctant affection. Evelyn Carver, sketching in the garden until the last moment, had gifted Lady Beatrice her portrait, a gesture that softened the edges of their brief acquaintance. Stokes himself, his duties resumed with silent precision, had betrayed no further hint of the shadow Miss Marple sensed in him. Though she suspected his story held chapters, yet unread. The necklace, now locked in a bank vault at Lady Beatrice's insistence, was safe, its sapphire gleam no longer a temptation. The drive to the station was quiet, the countryside rolling past in a blur of green and gold. Miss Marple, her knitting needles clicking softly in her lap, reflected on the events of the past days. The mystery had been a simple one, in essence. A man, driven by debt, a valuable jewel, a moment of weakness, Yet simplicity, she knew, was deceptive. In St. Mary Mead, she had seen similar tales. A farmer's son stealing to cover a bad wager, a maid pilfering to fund a secret romance, each revealing the universal frailties of the human heart. Gerald's desperation, Clara's pride, Evelyn's wariness, Stokes's guarded calm. All were threads in a tapestry she had seen woven countless times before. At the station, as she boarded the train to St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to her village, with its familiar faces and quiet rhythms. There would be tea with Mrs. Bantry, perhaps a gossip-filled chat with the postmistress, and always the gentle click of her needles as she unravelled the small mysteries of daily life. Haverford Hall, with its grandeur and secrets, was but a brief interlude, a reminder that human nature was the same everywhere. Its flaws and virtues laid bare by the smallest of acts. As the train pulled away, the manor receded into the distance, its chimneys just visible above the trees. Miss Marple opened her knitting bag, her fingers finding the familiar rhythm of her work. There would always be another puzzle, another truth to uncover, and she would be ready, her quiet eyes and sharp mind ever watchful for the patterns that others missed. The countryside sped by, and she smiled to herself, content in the knowledge that wherever she went, the world would offer its secrets, and she would be there to meet them.